Claude responded. Margaret Chen had been reviewing cardiac clearance files for 11 years when Richard Holloway walked through the doors of Meridian University Hospital. Margaret Chen had been reviewing cardiac clearance files for 11 years when Richard Holloway walked through the doors of Meridian University Hospital. He came in through the executive entrance on the fourth floor, the one reserved for board members and high-value referrals, wearing the same kind of suit he always wore, the kind that announced before he spoke that his time was worth more than yours. I recognized his name on the chart before my assistant had finished saying it aloud. Richard Holloway, Vice President of Operations, Castellan Group, 54 years old, presenting with unstable angina following an episode 3 days prior. I set the file on my desk and looked at it for a long moment. I am Dr. Margaret Chen, Chief Medical Officer of Meridian University Hospital's Cardiovascular Institute. I have been in this chair, in this exact department, for 4 years. Before that, I spent 7 years as attending cardiologist at St. Anselm's Medical Center across town. Before that, I trained under Dr. Hiram Osei-Bonsu at the Hargrove Cardiac Fellowship Program in Philadelphia. I have reviewed more than 9,000 cardiac clearance files in my career. I have authorized surgical procedures that other physicians declined to sign off on. I have also declined to authorize procedures that administrators wanted approved. The file in front of me contained Richard Holloway's name, his date of birth, his insurance policy number, and the preliminary EKG readings from Mercy General's emergency intake 3 days prior. It contained his medical records request form, signed by his personal physician. It did not contain any indication that he knew whose desk it had landed on. I picked up the phone and called the intake coordinator. "Tell Mr. Holloway's care team I'll have a preliminary review ready by end of day Thursday," I said, "and make sure his full cardiac history is uploaded to the portal before noon tomorrow. I want everything, not just the last 5 years." I set the phone down. I looked at the file again. 8 years earlier, he had invited me to lunch to fire me. He had ordered the sea bass. He had let me finish my meal before he slid the termination papers across the table. He had said very calmly that the hospital was moving in a different direction, that my contract would not be renewed, that he appreciated my years of service. He had smiled when he said it. I had smiled back. "Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you have ever been told by someone who should have believed in you that you were not capable, that you were not worth investing in, that your ambitions were too large for your actual abilities, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. Because I spent years believing that the people who said those things to me might have been right, and I want you to know what I eventually understood. They were not assessing me. They were protecting themselves from what I might become. But to understand why that Thursday morning meant what it did, why I sat in my office with Richard Holloway's cardiac file in my hands and felt something very close to calm, I have to take you back. 22 years back. I was 28 years old. I had just been accepted to the post-baccalaureate pre-medical program at Kellner University. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, and I remember standing in the hallway of the house I shared with my older sister, Patricia, and her husband, Douglas Reeve, holding that letter with both hands. I had been living with them for 14 months at that point. I was paying reduced rent, $400 a month, in exchange for helping with their 2 children after school. It was a practical arrangement. I had told myself it was temporary. Patricia was 36 at the time. Douglas was 39. They had built what looked, from the outside, like a comfortable life. Douglas ran the regional operations for a logistics company. Patricia managed the household and volunteered on the board of their neighborhood association. They had an investment property in the same suburb, a financial advisor named Gerald Fitch at Portsmouth Wealth Management, and opinions about every decision I had ever made. I showed Patricia the letter that evening at dinner. She read it. She set it down beside her plate. She cut a piece of chicken and put it in her mouth and chewed it carefully. "Margaret," she said finally, "you're 28. I know how old I am. Medical school would be, what, 4 years, and then residency on top of that. You'd be 40 before you ever made a real salary. Cardiologists earn well past the investment." Douglas looked up from his plate. "Cardiologists," he said it the way you say a word you've heard mispronounced. "You're planning to be a cardiologist. I'm planning to go to medical school. The specialty comes later." Patricia and Douglas exchanged a look. I had grown up watching that look pass between them. It was a look that said, "We have already decided, and we are being very patient with you." "We think," Patricia said, "that this is a phase. You've always had these ideas. Remember the law program? Remember the design certificate? I completed the design certificate. And then you didn't use it. Margaret, you're smart. But there's a difference between being smart and having the discipline for something like this. Douglas set down his fork. There's also the question of money. You're not going to find anyone to fund this. Student loans at your age, for medical school, the numbers don't work. I had already run the numbers. I had spoken with a financial aid counselor at Kellner. I had identified a grant program through the Marlowe Foundation for non-traditional pre-medical students. I had calculated that if I continued working part-time as a medical transcriptionist while completing the post-bac program, I could cover the first year's tuition without borrowing. I had written all of this down in a notebook that I kept in my room. I did not share any of it at the dinner table. What I said instead was, I've looked into the funding options. Patricia smiled in a way that did not involve her eyes. We just don't want to see you disappointed again. There had been a moment, before my father died, when the family estate had been discussed. He had 3 children, Patricia, myself, and our younger brother, Calvin. He had a house, a modest retirement savings account, and a life insurance policy. When he passed, Patricia had managed the estate as the eldest. The house sold for $187,000. After the mortgage payoff and the estate attorney's fees, the remainder was divided. Patricia handled the accounting. Calvin and I each received $31,400. Patricia retained an additional $24,000 as executor compensation, which she said was standard, and which she had arranged with the family law attorney before any of us had been consulted. I did not contest it. I was 26 at the time and I did not know what I was entitled to contest. That $31,400 was sitting in a savings account when the Kellner letter arrived. It was every dollar I had. I told Patricia and Douglas that evening that I was going to enroll. I told them clearly, without raising my voice. Patricia said, "We think you'll reconsider." I went to my room. I wrote down the name of the Marlowe Foundation grant program on a piece of paper. I folded it and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. The Kellner post-baccalaureate program accepted 18 students per cohort. I was the second oldest in my group. The youngest was 22 and had the easy confidence of someone who had never been told their ambitions were inconvenient. I did not resent him. I studied beside him for 2 years and I learned, from watching him, that confidence was not a personality trait. It was a posture you practiced until your body forgot it was performing. The science work came back to me faster than I expected and slower than I needed. Biochemistry was the first wall. I sat with it every night from 7 to 11 at a table in the Kellner library, and I built a vocabulary for it the way you build anything without help, piece by piece, checking your work against itself. I failed the first unit exam, not by a wide margin but by enough. The professor, Dr. Adiz Nwasu, pulled me aside after she returned the exams and said, without preamble, "You're not failing because you can't do this. You're failing because you're studying the wrong way. Come to my office hours on Wednesday." I went. She showed me. I did not fail another unit exam for the rest of the program. The Marlowe Foundation grant required an interview, a 1,200-word personal statement, and 2 letters of recommendation from academic faculty. Dr. Nwasu wrote one of them. The grant awarded $18,500 to 12 recipients nationally. I was one of them. The notification came by email at 6:47 in the morning and I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee because I had not slept very much. I read the email 3 times. Then I got up, washed my face, and went to my first class of the day. I did not tell Patricia. I did not tell Douglas. I did not tell Calvin, who had his own complicated relationship with ambition and would have mentioned it to Patricia within the week. I sat my MCAT on a Saturday in April. I scored in the 91st percentile. The score arrived 6 weeks later. I looked at it. I printed it. I put it in the notebook. My application to the Carver College of Medicine at Alderton University took 4 months to complete. I submitted it on a Wednesday in September. I drove home from the library where I had uploaded the final documents, and I stopped at a diner on Route 7 and ordered coffee and eggs, and I sat there for 40 minutes by myself, and I thought about my father, about the way he used to say, when Patricia dismissed something he cared about, "Some things you just keep to yourself, Maggie, until they're ready." He had been talking about his vegetable garden. He planted it every spring and never told anyone what he was growing until it came up. I understood, that night at the diner, that I had been doing the same thing. My first medical school interview was at Carver. The panel included 3 physicians and an administrative dean. One of the physicians asked me why I had waited until my late 20s to pursue medicine. I said, I needed to be certain. Some decisions are worth the time they take. She wrote something on her notepad. I received the acceptance letter 11 weeks later. Patricia called me the week after I started at Carver. She was calling, she said, to check in. She asked how things were going. I told her school had started. There was a pause. You actually enrolled, she said. I did. Another pause. Well, I hope you know what you're doing. I do, I said, and I ended the call. The first year of medical school is designed, I think, to determine who wants it enough to survive being humiliated by their own ignorance. You discover, very quickly, how much you do not know. Students around me had spent their entire adult lives preparing for exactly this. Many of them had parents who were physicians. Many of them had done research internships, shadowing programs, volunteer rotations. I had a design certificate and 2 years of post-bac coursework and a grant from the Marlowe Foundation. I survived the first year by sleeping 6 hours a night and spending the other 18 in sustained contact with the material. I also survived it because of Renata Iglesias-Morrow. Renata was in my year at Carver. She was 31, a former nurse practitioner from Houston, and she had the practical, unceremonious intelligence of someone who had already seen what happened when medicine went wrong. She sat down beside me in the first week of gross anatomy and said, without introduction, "You look like you're doing math in your head. What are you calculating?" "Whether I made a mistake," I said. "You didn't," she said. "I can tell. The people who made mistakes look panicked. You just look like you're working." We studied together every Thursday evening for 4 years. She is now a senior hospitalist at Greenfield Memorial in Houston. We still talk every few weeks. She was the first person, outside of Dr. Nwasu, who understood what I was building, and she never once asked me why I needed to build it without announcing it. The first time I almost didn't make it was in my 3rd year, during the surgical rotation at Carver's affiliated hospital, Whitmore General. I had developed what the rotation supervisor initially described as a communication gap with the attending surgeon, Dr. Frederick Langham, which was a careful way of saying that Dr. Langham did not like being questioned by 3rd-year students, particularly 3rd-year students who had identified an inconsistency in a post-op note and raised it quietly during rounds. The inconsistency was real. The medication dosage recorded in the patient's medical records did not match the dosage that had been administered. I had cross-checked it twice. I reported it through the appropriate channel. I went to the charge nurse, Dora Mbeki, and asked her to verify the documentation before I escalated. Dr. Langham found out. He called me into his office and told me that if I wanted to survive residency, I needed to learn the difference between thoroughness and insubordination. I said the patient's health insurance coverage would have been affected by that documentation error, so would the hospital's liability exposure. He stared at me for a moment. "The note was corrected," he said finally. "I know," I said. "I checked." He did not speak to me again outside of clinical requirements for the remaining 6 weeks of the rotation. My evaluation from him was a 3 out of 5, with the note that I demonstrated strong clinical instincts but required development in team integration. The rotation supervisor, Dr. Pamela Ostrowski, reviewed my evaluation personally. She called me in and asked me to walk her through what had happened. I did. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "The note was corrected. The patient was protected, that's what matters." She changed my final rotation grade to a 4. She also wrote a note in my file that said I had demonstrated exceptional attention to clinical documentation standards. I kept that evaluation in the notebook too. I matched into my residency program on a Friday in March. Internal medicine at Hargrove Medical Center in Philadelphia, one of 11 spots for 312 applicants. I packed my apartment in 2 days. I drove to Philadelphia with everything I owned in the back of a 2003 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard and a check engine light that had been on for 11 months. I did not tell Patricia I was leaving the state. She found out 6 weeks later when she called and I mentioned, in passing, that I was on call at Hargrove and couldn't talk. "You're in Philadelphia?" she said. "Yes." "Since when?" 6 weeks. The silence on the line was very long. "You didn't think to tell us," she said. "I didn't think it required an announcement," I said. She made a sound that was not quite a word and ended the call. I was 34 years old. I was doing my first year of internal medicine residency in a city where I knew no one except a pharmacist named Carl who lived in my apartment building and was unfailingly friendly in the elevator. I was earning $57,200 a year, which covered rent, student loan payments on the income-driven repayment plan, and food, with roughly $310 left over each month. I was the happiest I had been in years. Residency at Hargrove was 3 years of internal medicine, followed by a 3-year cardiology fellowship under Dr. Hiram Osaibansu, who was, at that point, one of the most respected interventional cardiologists in the Mid-Atlantic region, and possibly the most demanding supervisor I have ever had. Dr. Osaibansu did not offer encouragement. He offered correction, specific, detailed, unflinching correction, and he expected you to apply it without requiring him to repeat himself. The first time he watched me interpret an EKG, he said nothing for a long moment and then said, "You're reading the rhythm correctly and the morphology incorrectly. Start over." I started over. He told me at the end of my second year of fellowship that I had the instincts of a clinician and the discipline of a scientist, which was the closest he came to a compliment and which I held onto for a long time. The Hargrove Cardiac Fellowship Program placed fellows at St. Anselm's Medical Center across the city upon completion. I completed the fellowship at 39. I joined St. Anselm's as an attending cardiologist in the Department of Cardiovascular Medicine. My salary was $287,000 in the first year. I remember sitting in my new office, a small one, second floor, window overlooking the parking structure, and looking at the number on the offer letter, and thinking about the dinner table in Patricia's house and Douglas's voice saying the numbers don't work. I thought about the $31,400 I had received from my father's estate, the $24,000 that Patricia had kept as executor compensation. I thought about a conversation I had had 2 years earlier with a colleague at Hargrove, Dr. Yusuf Ibarra, a second-year hospitalist, who had mentioned during a lunch break that he was working with an estate attorney named Claire Donovan at Westfield and Pritchard Law Group to revisit the settlement of his mother's estate. He said the process was slower than he expected, but that it had been worth beginning. I had written down the name, Claire Donovan, Westfield and Pritchard, on a prescription notepad and folded it into my wallet. I still had not done anything with it, but I had kept it. At St. Anselm's, I spent 7 years building a reputation that I did not discuss outside the hospital. I published 4 papers in peer-reviewed journals, 2 on risk stratification in non-obstructive coronary artery disease, 1 on health insurance coverage gaps affecting delayed specialist appointment uptake in underserved cardiac populations, and 1 co-authored study with Dr. Osaibansu on long-term outcomes in women with atypical MI presentations. The co-authored paper was cited 47 times in the first 2 years after publication. In my 5th year at St. Anselm's, the department head, Dr. Constance Farrow, recommended me for the vice chair position in the Department of Cardiovascular Medicine. I declined. I had my eye on something else. I had been watching the Meridian University Hospital Cardiovascular Institute for 3 years. It was expanding. It had just completed a $42 million facility renovation. It had opened a new interventional suite and was recruiting a permanent chief medical officer to head the institute. I applied in September of my 7th year at St. Anselm's. The search committee reviewed 41 candidates over 4 months. I interviewed twice, first with the search committee, then with the hospital's executive leadership, which included a man named Richard Holloway, vice president of operations, Castellan Group, the hospital's parent management organization. He had shaken my hand across a conference room table and said he was impressed by my publication record. He had asked me about my long-term vision for the Institute's role in the regional cardiac care network. I had answered for 11 minutes without notes. He had nodded and written something on the notepad in front of him. I was offered the position 4 weeks later. Chief Medical Officer, Cardiovascular Institute, Meridian University Hospital. Base salary $389,000, plus departmental budget authority, up to $2.1 million annually. I accepted by phone on a Tuesday afternoon in November. That night I drove to the parking structure outside St. Anselm's and sat in my car for 20 minutes. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I sat there in the dark with the engine off, and I let the number settle into me, not the salary, not the title, but the distance. the distance between the dinner table in Patricia's house and the chair I was about to occupy. 22 years. I had been building for 22 years without ever letting them see the blueprint. I thought briefly about calling Patricia. I did not. I started at Meridian the following February. My deputy, Dr. Oluwatobi Ademi, had already been there for 3 years and knew where every body was buried, figuratively, and in the case of one badly misfiled malpractice complaint, almost literally. He became the most reliable partner I have had in an institutional setting. He was the only person at Meridian who knew the full shape of my history, the post-bac program, the Marlowe grant, the dinner table, the estate, the notebook. He had asked me 6 months into our working relationship why I had never gone public with any of it, why I had never written about it or spoken about it at the conferences where people sometimes gave those kinds of talks. I told him I was waiting. For what? He said. For the right moment, I said. He looked at me for a second. You think it's coming, don't you, whatever it is? Something always comes, I said. You just have to have built enough by then to handle it. He nodded slowly. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the carafe on the credenza and said nothing else. That conversation happened on a Wednesday in October. The following month, Richard Holloway called my office. My assistant took the message. The note said, Mr. Holloway, Castellan Group, asks if you are available for lunch to discuss Cardiovascular Institute's Q4 performance metrics. His preference is Riva on the waterfront, Thursday at noon. I read the message. I told my assistant to confirm Thursday at noon. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. That Thursday, I sat across from Richard Holloway at Riva, with the harbor visible through the window behind him, and I watched him read from a printed summary of the Institute's Q4 numbers. He talked about throughput. He talked about reimbursement cycles. He talked about the board's interest in expanding the Institute's elective surgical volume. He was charming, in the way that men like Richard Holloway are charming, fluent in the vocabulary of collaborative partnership while the briefcase beside his chair contained the thing he had not yet mentioned. He mentioned it over dessert. Margaret, he said. He used my first name, which he had never done in a professional setting. I want to be straightforward with you. The board has been reviewing the CMO structure. There's a feeling, and I want you to hear this as constructive, that the Institute may benefit from a leadership transition, someone with a stronger background in operational scaling. He had the paperwork in the briefcase. He slid it across the table after the coffee arrived. I read the termination notice in full. I set it down. I picked up my coffee. I finished my meal. When I looked up, he was watching me with the expression of someone who had expected more reaction. You have 30 days, he said. The transition team will be in touch. I said, thank you for lunch, Richard. I folded the termination papers and put them in my bag. I left a 20% tip. I walked to my car in the parking garage and I sat there for 4 minutes. Then I drove back to my office and started building what came next. 8 years passed. 8 years of building what came next. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late March, my assistant came into my office and set a referral packet on my desk and said, this one came through executive intake. I flagged it because the insurance policy flagged a prior auth issue on the stress imaging. You'll want to look at the medical records before Thursday. I looked at the name on the referral packet. Richard Holloway, 54 years old. Unstable angina. No current cardiologist of record. His prior physician had retired, and his new health insurance coverage through Castellan Group's executive plan required a specialist appointment authorization from the receiving institution's CMO before any advanced imaging could be ordered. The CMO of Meridian University Hospital's Cardiovascular Institute. I set the packet down on my desk. I looked out the window at the harbor. Somewhere in his briefcase, I thought, he had the kind of papers that required a signature. This time, the signature was mine. Claude responded. I reviewed Richard Holloway's referral packet for 45 minutes that first morning. I reviewed Richard Holloway's referral packet for 45 minutes that first morning. I read every page of his preliminary medical records from Mercy General's emergency intake. I reviewed the EKG strips. I looked at the troponin levels, the lipid panel, the imaging notes from the ER attending. I looked at his current medications. I noted that he had been on a statin for 6 years, but that his LDL was still running at 142 on his last draw, which told me something about either his adherence or his absorption, and that question would need answering before we could build a treatment plan. I was not thinking about the lunch at Riva. I was thinking about his coronary anatomy and what his stress test results were going to show. That is the thing about medicine that people outside it sometimes misunderstand. The work does not pause for the story. The patient in front of you is the patient in front of you. Whatever they were to you before the chart arrived on your desk, they are, in that moment, a person with a body that is doing something dangerous, and your job is to understand what that is and to stop it. I have held that line for 22 years of practice. I held it that morning. What I also held, with full clarity, was the specific procedural situation I was now in. Richard Holloway's health insurance coverage through Castellan Group's Executive Benefits Plan had a prior authorization requirement for advanced cardiac imaging. The plan required that the receiving institution's chief medical officer sign off on the medical necessity before a stress echocardiogram or coronary CT angiography could be ordered. It was a standard insurance policy architecture, one I had reviewed hundreds of times from the other side of the desk, writing necessity letters on behalf of patients whose coverage was being questioned. In this case, the CMO whose authorization was required was me. The prior auth request sat in a queue in my department's administrative system, generated automatically when the referral was processed. My name was listed as the authorizing physician. The request was timestamped Tuesday at 9:14 in the morning. I looked at it for a moment. Then I pulled up his medical records in full and began building the clinical picture. What the records showed was a man who had been ignoring a moderately elevated cardiovascular risk profile for approximately 7 years. His blood pressure had been consistently in the high normal range since his late 40s. His weight had increased by 22 pounds over the same period. He had a first-degree relative with early coronary artery disease, his father, who had a documented MI at 58. Richard was 54. The numbers were not ambiguous. The emergency episode 3 days prior had produced troponin values that rose and then fell over a 6-hour window, a pattern consistent with demand ischemia or a minor plaque rupture event. The Mercy general attending had stabilized him, managed him overnight, and discharged him with a referral for outpatient cardiology evaluation and the instruction to avoid strenuous activity. He had been given a 30-day supply of dual antiplatelet therapy and told to follow up within 1 week. He had waited 3 days and come to Meridian. I authorized the imaging on Wednesday morning. I wrote the medical necessity letter myself, 4 paragraphs, specific, clinically grounded, citing the troponin pattern, the family history, the risk factor burden. I sent it to the insurance policy administrator at Castellan Group's benefits office. I copied Dr. Oluwatobi Ademi, my deputy, because Tobai reviewed everything I sent out on high-profile referrals. That was our arrangement. He appeared in my doorway 20 minutes after the email went out. "Holloway," he said. "Yes." He came in and sat down. He looked at me with the particular expression he used when he was calculating something. "You're going to handle this personally. I'm going to handle it clinically. That's not the same thing. Margaret." Tobai. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me in the room when you meet him?" "Not yet," I said. "Schedule the stress echo for Friday. I'll do the pre-procedure consult Thursday afternoon." He looked at me for another second, then he nodded and stood. "Claire Donovan called," he said at the door. "She said the documents are ready whenever you want to come in." I had been waiting for that call for 3 weeks. I want to explain Claire Donovan, because she matters to this story in ways that have nothing to do with Richard Holloway. I had called Claire Donovan at Westfield and Pritchard Law Group 2 months after I started at Meridian, 4 years before Richard Holloway's referral arrived on my desk. I had taken the prescription notepad with her name on it out of my wallet. I had looked at it for a moment, and then I had dialed. She was an estate attorney who also practiced elder law. She had been in practice for 19 years. She was direct, methodical, and she had told me at our first meeting that what I was describing, the executor compensation arrangement, the estate accounting, my father's will and trust documents, the absence of any financial disclosure provided to the non-executor beneficiaries, was worth examining carefully. That examination had taken 4 years. What Claire had found, over those 4 years, required a forensic accountant named David Rourke, 3 rounds of subpoenaed bank records, and one very specific provision in my father's original will that Patricia's family law attorney had apparently advised her to interpret in a way that Claire described, quietly and without drama, as a significant deviation from the document's plain language. The provision concerned the $24,000 executor compensation. My father's will specified a flat executor fee of $8,000. The will and trust documents were unambiguous on this point. Claire had obtained a certified copy of the original will from the probate court's records. She had obtained the estate attorney's billing records through a formal discovery request in the civil proceeding she had filed on my behalf. She had obtained Patricia's bank statements for the 18 months surrounding the estate settlement. The picture that emerged was not complicated. It was simply the picture of someone who had decided that no one was paying close enough attention. I had been paying attention for 8 years. The civil proceeding was not a criminal matter. Claire had been clear with me about that from the beginning. What she had filed was a petition to reopen the estate and compel an accounting. The legal settlement we were pursuing was the difference between the $8,000 flat fee specified in the will and the $24,000 Patricia had retained, plus interest, plus attorney's fees, as the court would determine. It was not a large sum in the context of my current life. That was not the point. The point was the will. The point was the trust documents. The point was my father's handwriting on a piece of paper saying, clearly, what he had intended for his children. That was worth the 4 years. That was worth the documents Claire was holding. I left the hospital at 6:30 on Wednesday evening and drove to Westfield and Pritchard's office on Hartwell Street. Claire met me in the conference room. She had the documents laid out on the table, the petition, the accounting demand, the supporting exhibits, the certified copy of the will with the relevant provision highlighted in yellow. She walked me through them. I read each page, I asked 4 questions. She answered all 4, then I signed. Service goes out tomorrow morning, she said. Patricia will receive it by end of business. I nodded. She looked at me with the careful assessment that I had come to recognize as her version of emotional acknowledgement. How are you? I'm fine, I said. I've been ready for a while. I know you have, she said. She collected the documents and set them in a folder. I'll call you when we have a response date. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and thought about my father's vegetable garden the way it came up every spring, patient and complete. I sat there for a long time. That was the first document. I had 3 more. Patricia called me the following afternoon, Thursday, at 2:47. I was between patient consults. I saw her name on my phone and let it ring twice before I answered. Margaret, she said. Her voice had a particular quality, tight at the edges, controlled in the center. I got something from a law firm today. I know, I said, a pause. What is this? It's a petition to reopen Dad's estate. Claire Donovan is my attorney. Everything you need to know is in the documents. You hired a family law attorney to go after me. Her voice shifted slightly on the word after. After 20 years. After 8 years of preparation and 22 years of thinking about it, I said. The petition is straightforward. Claire has done thorough work. I'd recommend you have your attorney review it carefully. Margaret, this is not what Dad would have wanted. To have us fighting over, Dad wanted the executor fee to be $8,000, I said. It says so in his will. That's not a fight, that's a document. A silence. I think we should talk in person, Patricia said. I think we should meet and talk about this like family. I'm happy to talk, I said. Have your attorney contact Claire, they can arrange a meeting. I ended the call. I set my phone on my desk. I looked at the window for a moment. Then I went to my next consult. The meeting happened 10 days later, on a Friday, in Claire's conference room on Hartwell Street. Patricia arrived with her attorney, a man named Bradley Morse from a mid-sized general practice firm downtown. She was dressed as she always dressed for important occasions, carefully, in colors that said she had considered the impression she was making. She sat across from me and she looked, for the first time in a long time, uncertain about something. Douglas was not present. Calvin had not responded to Claire's communication. Bradley Morse talked for 12 minutes about the complexities of estate accounting and the long passage of time since the settlement and the question of whether the legal standard for reopening was met. Claire listened. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her and she made 4 notes during his 12 minutes. When he finished, she responded for 4 minutes. She cited the statutory authority, the specific provision of my father's will, the documented deviation, and the interest calculation. Bradley Morse looked at his client. Patricia looked at me. I don't understand why you're doing this, she said, after everything. I kept my hands flat on the table. I looked at her, and then at the certified copy of our father's will which was sitting in a clear plastic sleeve in front of Claire's notepad. After everything, I said, is exactly why. She started to say something and stopped. Her hands, which had been folded on the table, went still. Bradley Moore said he would need time to review the documents and consult with his client. Claire said that was fine and named a response deadline 14 days out. We stood. Patricia looked at me one more time as she gathered her things. She looked at me the way she had looked at the Kellner acceptance letter at the dinner table, processing something that did not fit the category she had assigned to it. I didn't know you had become, she started. I know you didn't, I said. She thought she had walked into a negotiation. She had 2 more days. What happened 2 days later was not planned. It was the kind of convergence that you could not have scheduled if you tried, and that, in retrospect, seems like the kind of thing that could only happen because every element had been in exactly the right position for exactly the right amount of time. Richard Holloway's stress echocardiogram was scheduled for Friday morning at 9. I had done the pre-procedure consult on Thursday afternoon, as planned. He had come in through the executive entrance again, this time in a sport coat instead of a suit, which I noted as a sign that someone had told him to dress casually for the procedure. He had been escorted to a consult room on the 3rd floor of the institute. My assistant had prepared his chart. His full medical history, his current medication list, his insurance policy details, his prior auth approval, everything was in order. She handed me the chart outside the consult room door and I reviewed the first page, and then I opened the door and walked in. He was sitting on the examination table, turning his phone over in his hands. He looked up when I came in. I watched the sequence move across his face. Recognition, partial, uncertain, working from a context he was not expecting. He knew me from somewhere, he was trying to place it. Professional setting, yes. My face, yes. But the lab coat, the title on the door, the chart in my hands were not fitting the frame he had stored. Mr. Holloway, I said. I'm Dr. Margaret Chen, Chief Medical Officer of the Cardiovascular Institute. I'll be overseeing your care. I watched it land. His face did something very specific, a controlled stillness that I recognized because I had seen it in my own mirror for years, the deliberate neutrality of someone recalibrating very quickly. Dr. Chen, he said. Yes, I said. I sat down across from him and opened his chart. Let's talk about what your imaging showed. He had significant stenosis in the left anterior descending artery, 73% occlusion at a critical segment. The stress echo had revealed a wall motion abnormality that the nuclear imaging confirmed. What Richard Holloway had was not a warning. What Richard Holloway had was a heart attack that had not happened yet but intended to. I told him this clearly and in plain language. I told him what the intervention options were. I told him what the outcomes looked like with treatment and without it. I told him the names of the 3 interventional cardiologists on my team and what each of them specialized in. I told him that Dr. Priya Subramanian was the one I would recommend for his specific anatomy, and that she had performed more than 600 percutaneous coronary interventions, and that her complication rate was among the lowest in the region. He listened to all of it without speaking. When I finished, he said, "You're recommending surgery. I'm recommending intervention. A percutaneous coronary intervention, a stenting procedure. It's not open-heart surgery. Dr. Subramanian will walk you through the details of the procedure at your consult. And if I want to proceed, then we get you scheduled. His insurance policy under Castellan Group covers the procedure at 100% in network. Meridian is in network. The prior authorization for the procedure goes through my office. There's no administrative delay." He looked at his hands. "Through your office," he said. "Through my office," I said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The weight of that sentence was settling. "I have to sign off on the medical necessity," I said, "and then Dr. Subramanian schedules the procedure. It's a straightforward process from here." He looked at me then directly with the full recognition finally assembled. "The lunch," he said. "Yes. Margaret, Dr. Chen, you owe me a decision," I said. "The clinical recommendation is clear. I'd like to schedule the consult with Dr. Subramanian for Monday. Does that work?" He looked at me for a long moment. He was a man who had built his professional life on reading rooms, on understanding who held what in a given situation and adjusting accordingly. He was reading this room now. "Yes," he said. "Monday works." "Good," I stood. I closed his chart. "My assistant will confirm the time." I walked to the door. He said my name, Dr. Chen, and I turned. "I want to say I'm sorry," he said. "For 8 years ago." I looked at him. He meant it. I could see that he meant it, not because he was frightened though he was, but because 8 years and a cardiovascular event have a way of reordering what a person knows about what matters. "I appreciate that," I said. "I'll see you Monday." I walked out. I walked down the hallway to the elevator. I pressed the button for the 4th floor. I stood in the elevator alone, watching the numbers. That was the moment. Not the lunch, not the papers, not the termination notice. That moment, in an elevator in a building where my name was on the door, where the procedure required my signature, where the man who had decided my career was over now required my professional judgment to continue his life. I was not triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something quieter, a kind of resolution, the way a problem resolves when you have finally found the correct variable. Something had been unsettled for a long time, and now it was not. The elevator opened on the fourth floor. I walked to my office. I sat down at my desk and I signed the prior authorization for Richard Holloway's coronary intervention procedure. He deserved the surgery. His coronary anatomy required it. My signature was the correct clinical decision, and I made it. Then I opened my email and wrote to Claire. The Medical Review Board of Meridian University Hospital convened its quarterly meeting on the second Tuesday of the month following Richard Holloway's intervention procedure. The meeting was held in the main conference room on the sixth floor, a room with a long table and 15 chairs, and a projection screen at one end. I had chaired this meeting 11 times. The attendees were department heads, senior clinical staff, administrative leadership, and 2 patient advocate representatives. That particular morning, there were 19 people in the room. Patricia was not in that room. I want to be precise about what the confrontation actually was, because it was not dramatic in the way that word implies. There was no scene. There was no raised voice. What happened was quieter than that, and more complete. The confrontation with my family happened over 3 occasions in the 8 weeks following the estate petition. I will tell you about all 3, because together they are the full picture. The first occasion was the response deadline Claire had given Bradley Morse. He filed a response that acknowledged the documentary record and proposed a settlement figure, not the full amount, but a number meant to test how serious I was. The number was $9,400. Claire forwarded it to me with a one-line email. Counter or proceed to hearing, I called her. Proceed, I said. The hearing was scheduled in probate court for a Tuesday morning 6 weeks out. Judge Anita Ferrer-Blount presiding. The courtroom held 37 seats. On the morning of the hearing, Patricia arrived with Bradley Morse and Douglas, who had apparently decided this was worth his attendance after all. Calvin was not present. He had called me the week prior, unexpectedly, and said he thought Patricia should settle and that he was staying out of it. That call had surprised me. It had also quietly meant something. Claire and I arrived 7 minutes before the scheduled time. We sat at the petitioner's table. I had a yellow legal pad in front of me that I did not use. Claire had 4 folders, tabbed and organized, and she had the forensic accountant David Rourke in the row behind us as a fact witness. The hearing opened. Judge Ferrer-Blount was efficient and specific. She had clearly read the petition. Bradley Morse presented the respondent's position for 11 minutes. He argued that the executor compensation, while above the flat fee specified in the will, was within the range of reasonable compensation for the complexity of the estate administration. He argued that the passage of time and the absence of any contemporaneous objection constituted an implied acceptance. Claire presented for 14 minutes. She walked through the will provision. She walked through the financial disclosure that had not been provided to the non-executor beneficiaries at the time of settlement. She introduced the certified accounting prepared by David Rourke, which showed the specific disbursements and the deviation from the will's specified fee. She introduced 3 exhibits. Each one was specific, documented, and unrebutted. Judge Ferrer-Blount asked Bradley Morse 2 questions. He answered both of them, and his answers confirmed what the documents already showed. The judge looked at the exhibits for a moment. The will's language is unambiguous, she said. The executor fee provision says $8,000. The record shows $16,000 in excess compensation was retained. The petition is granted. Respondent will remit the principal amount of $16,000 to the petitioner within 30 days, plus statutory interest and petitioner's attorney's fees as determined. That was the first document resolved. I had 3 more that Claire was still working. Patricia looked at me across the aisle when the judge had finished speaking. Douglas was looking at the table. Bradley Morse was writing something on his notepad. Patricia's face had the expression of someone standing in a room they had been certain was theirs and discovering all at once that the locks had been changed. She did not say anything. Neither did I. We stood. We gathered our things. Claire touched my arm briefly, the smallest gesture, professional and human at the same time. I nodded. We walked out into the hallway. The fluorescent light was the same light as every hallway in every institution I had ever worked in. I found that I was glad to be standing in it. The second occasion was a phone call. Patricia called me 3 days after the hearing. She asked if we could meet, not through the attorneys, just the two of us, somewhere quiet. I agreed. We met at a coffee shop on Marlow Street on a Thursday afternoon. She arrived first. I arrived exactly on time. She had aged in the past months in a way that had nothing to do with years. She looked like someone who had been revising a story they had told themselves for a long time and finding, in the revision, that certain things they had been certain of were not in the original text. She did not contest the outcome. She had processed that, I think, in the days after the hearing. What she wanted, I understood gradually as we sat there, was to understand the full shape of what had happened. Not the legal shape, the human one. How long have you been building this? She said. She did not mean the legal case, she meant everything. Since the dinner table, I said, since the Kellner letter. She was quiet for a moment. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I didn't know, she said, what you were going to become. No, I said, you didn't. I thought I was being realistic. I know you did. She looked out the window. A bus went past. She said, Dad would have been proud of you. That was the hardest sentence she had ever said to me. Not because it was wrong, I believed it was true, but because it was the sentence she should have said 22 years earlier, and the distance between then and now was the full weight of everything I had built in the silence she had made. Yes, I said. I think he would have. We sat there for another 20 minutes. We did not resolve everything. We did not become the sisters we might have been. But something shifted, something in the architecture of it, and I drove home that evening understanding that the confrontation I had prepared for was not the one that had mattered most. The one that mattered most was that Thursday afternoon in a coffee shop on Marlow Street, 2 cups of coffee, a bus going past, and 22 years of silence between us finally breathing. The third occasion was Patricia's remittance of the $16,000, plus interest, plus attorney's fees, which Claire confirmed arrived in full on the 28th day of the 30-day window. Claire sent me an email. The subject line was, "Received in full." No additional text. I read it at my desk. I looked out the window at the harbor. I thought about the piece of paper I had put in my wallet 22 years ago. The Marlowe Foundation grant program, folded small, kept for 6 years. I thought about how long something can stay folded before it opens. Richard Holloway had his intervention procedure with Dr. Priya Subramanian on a Wednesday morning. The procedure took 41 minutes. Dr. Subramanian deployed 2 stents in the lad. The technical result was excellent, TIMI3 flow restored, no complications. He went home on Thursday afternoon. His discharge paperwork included a cardiac rehabilitation referral, a modified medication regimen, and a follow-up appointment with me in 4 weeks. He came to the follow-up on time. He sat across from me in the consult room. His blood pressure was 118/74. His heart rate was 64. He looked, as people often look after a near miss has been caught and corrected, like a man who had recently understood something. He said, "You didn't have to take my case." "No," I said, "but you did. The clinical indication was clear," I said, "and you needed the best team available." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to make it right," he said. "Professionally, what I did 8 years ago." "What you did 8 years ago was a business decision," I said. "I made different decisions after it, that's the story." He nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. He was a man who had spent his career moving people like pieces on a board, and he was sitting in a room where the piece he had moved had become the board. "The Institute's cardiovascular outcomes data," he said. "I've been reading it, it's extraordinary." "My team is extraordinary," I said. "I'm very fortunate in who I work with." He left. I made a note in his chart. I scheduled his next appointment for 3 months out. I sat for a moment after he was gone, in the quiet of the consult room, before my next appointment arrived. I had not forgiven Richard Holloway in the way that word is sometimes used, as if forgiveness is the erasure of the record. The record was the record. He had ended my contract and handed me, without knowing it, the necessity that made everything after it possible. If he had not done that, I might have stayed at Meridian's predecessor, in a comfortable mid-level role, building a moderate career. The termination had been the push I needed to build what I actually built. I could hold both of those things at the same time, that what he did was wrong, and that where I ended up was right. That is not a comfortable place to stand. But it is an honest one. I also held with full clarity that what Patricia had done was wrong in a different register, more intimate, more lasting, and ultimately more in need of resolution than anything Richard Holloway had signed. The estate matter was resolved. The attorney's fees were paid. The documents were filed. The court order was final. What remained was harder to file. What remained was the shape of a family, two sisters in a coffee shop on Marlow Street, and the slow, uncertain work of understanding what we were to each other now that the long silence was over. I did not know how that would resolve. I still don't, entirely. Patricia and I speak on the phone occasionally. The calls are careful, brief, and more honest than any conversation we had in the 22 years before the hearing. That is not nothing. It may in time become something. Calvin called me on my birthday that year. He said he was proud of me. He asked if I wanted to have dinner sometime. I said yes. We have had dinner 4 times since. He is quieter than he used to be, and he asks better questions than I expected. I find that I like knowing him. I still run the Cardiovascular Institute at Meridian. Dr. Oluwatobi Ademi is still my deputy, still the most reliable partner I have had in an institutional setting, and still the only person at the hospital who occasionally calls me on the things I am not seeing clearly. I value that more than I value most things. Dr. Priya Subramanian has been named to the Regional Interventional Cardiology Task Force, which is exactly where she belongs. I keep the notebook in my desk drawer. The one I started at Kellner. The one with the MCAT score, the Marlowe grant notification, the training evaluations, the names and dates and specific figures that are the real record of what I built. I have not added anything to it in 2 years. I don't think I need to. The story it was holding is finished. On the Saturday after Richard Holloway's follow-up appointment, I drove out to the cemetery where my father is buried. I don't do this often. But there are days when the distance I have traveled becomes real to me in a way that requires the specific quiet of that place. I stood there for a while. It was a mild day, overcast but not cold, the kind of light that makes everything look exact and considered. I thought about the vegetable garden, about how he never told anyone what he was planting until it came up, about how patient that required you to be, about how much faith it required in the thing you were building in the ground. I thought, I kept your faith, Dad. I kept it folded in my wallet for 6 years and then I planted it and I kept showing up until it came up. I drove home. I made dinner. I sat at the kitchen table with the window open, the sound of the street below, and I let the evening settle into itself. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. What you build in silence, you own completely. No one can take credit for it, diminish it, or reframe it, because they were never in the room when it was made. 2. Documentation is not coldness, it is the language of institutions. And when you speak it fluently and the people who underestimated you do not, the record speaks for itself without you having to raise your voice. 3. Your identity is not a verdict handed down by the people who knew you before you became yourself. It is the accumulation of every choice you made when no one was watching, and it belongs to no one but you. Was I wrong to stay silent for 22 years, to let my family believe what they believed about me, to build everything I built without ever showing them the blueprint, rather than confronting them earlier and giving them the chance to change? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.